Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar, Ending Child Poverty on the Federal and State Level. I'm Cara Balderi with First Focus Campaign for Children. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, we're a national bipartisan kids advocacy organization dedicated to making children and families a priority in federal budget and policy decisions. We are very honored to be co-hosting this webinar with our colleagues at GRACE and the End Child Poverty California campaign, with special thanks to Shamika Gaskins for her camaraderie in putting this event together. We're also always honored, to work alongside the Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy in New York and Youth Development Institute in Puerto Rico. And we are very grateful to our many congressional champions who you'll be hearing from today, which include Congressman Jimmy Gomez, Congresswoman Judy Chu, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, Congresswoman Karen Bass, Congresswoman Lucia Roybal Allard, who are all from California, I'll note, and Congressman Danny Davis of Illinois. First Focus convenes the U.S. Child Poverty Action Group, which is a partnership of organizations who are dedicated to establishing a national child poverty reduction target in the United States. In 2019, following the release of the landmark National Academy of Sciences study, A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty, which gave us the evidence base to know that progress is possible, we launched the End Child Poverty U.S. campaign to ramp up our efforts and learn from similar campaigns happening around the country, some of which you're going to hear from more today. Child poverty has been in the news a lot lately, as improvements to the child tax credit in last year's American Rescue Plan made significant strides in cutting our national child poverty rate and keeping millions of children, including millions of children of color, from experiencing poverty in 2021. But the lapse of these payments is now forcing millions of children back into poverty. We see the establishment of a national child poverty reduction target as a way to build the political will to get a permanent child allowance, as well as other important policies over the finish line. It is a means to the very important end of eliminating child poverty in the United States. We are inspired and informed by international examples in the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, as well as the work of advocates here in the US who are leading campaigns to form and reach poverty reduction targets around the country. And I'm going to introduce a few of these advocates just shortly. We hope you'll come away from this webinar inspired to take action on the federal level, and I'm going to tell you how, as well as in your own community. So first, I want to go over a few logistics. This webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be circulated afterwards to anyone who registered. It will also be available on the U.S. Child Poverty Action Group website, which is endchildpovertyus.org, under the Webinars tab. We'll be taking questions at the end, but feel free to submit them as you think of them. Depending on how you are viewing this event, you can put your questions in the chat or comments or through Twitter using the hashtag #EndChildPoverty. So I'm now going to turn over to Shamika Gaskins, President and CEO of GRACE and the End Child Poverty California campaign, to introduce the first members of Congress that we're going to be hearing from today.
Good morning from California. Good afternoon to all our friends on the East Coast and beyond. So happy to be here. Thank you so much, Cara, for your leadership and First Focus and the End Child Poverty Action Group. I'm really excited to be here today and to introduce our Congressman, Jimmy Gomez. He proudly represents California's 34th Congressional District, one of the most diverse districts and culturally rich districts in the country. He currently serves as Vice Chair of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and sits on the powerful Ways and Means Committee and serves as the Assistant Whip for the House Democratic Caucus. Prior to being elected to Congress, he served in the California legislature, where he was known to be a national champion for paid family leave and climate change. We're really excited to have him here with us today. He's not quite yet on the webinar. We know he will be here shortly, but really just thankful that today's conversation, as Cara mentioned, includes a number of the California delegation to be a part of this conversation. And I think we are excited that we've had so many strong champions to work on child poverty at the state level and federally, many of them coming from state leadership before they entered into their federal service. And so I think they've all really seen firsthand the impact that poverty has had on generations of children in California, and want to make sure that we can continue the work here to make sure that we have better outcomes, but that we are reaching children all across the country. And that is the work of the Child Poverty Action Group, the work that so many have come together over decades to really lead the way and raise awareness around the needs of children and families in this country. It's quite remarkable, as we've all talked about for many, many decades, how often, we are faced with these moral decisions in terms of our budgets every year at the federal level and across our states. And at the time, every year we're trying to decide how do we need to spend the dollars that we have in this country. And we need champions who are going to say we need to put children and families first. So I think we have one of those champions right here. So welcome, Congressman Gomez.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So happy to have you, and just really excited to hear what you have to share today about the work that you're doing.
No, thank you so much. Really focusing on children and families is the best way to make a long-term investment in our country. I once described a child's life as like shooting an arrow. It's easier to change the trajectory of that life at the beginning than in the middle or at the end. And that's what we're trying to do with a lot of the policies that we're trying to pass at the U.S. Congress, but also at the federal level, and even here at the state level. Is like, how do we invest in kids and family early to have a profound impact on that life? I'm, as somebody who is the youngest of 6 of immigrant parents who watched my parents work 4, 5, 6 jobs a week to make ends meet. We didn't have health insurance. There was times that we had to scrimp and save, but we always had plenty to eat, and we always had plenty of food. And that's not the same for everybody. Some people are worse off, even if we're overcrowded in my household. Latino, Black, Indigenous, and even some Asian families are disproportionately impacted by poverty. And that's been exacerbated over the last several decades when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the housing crisis, when it comes to a variety of issues. So we're trying to work on making sure that we target more resources to these families so that we can have a profound impact. One of the things that we did, what I was proud of, is the child tax credit. The Republicans rolled back some of the provisions. Before, you didn't need a social security number to get the child tax credit. They made it so that you had to have a social security number. They did expand it as the amount, but they excluded people that are in need of that help. So when we passed the American Rescue Plan, we made some changes. We undid the provision that some of the provisions and how it was applied, that you need a social security number, that different people who are I-10 holders can get a hold of it, and all U.S. born children. So before they were punishing them. But one of the biggest things that we did, and I think this is amazing, is that we made the child tax credit fully refundable. What that means is that you don't need to owe taxes in order to get the benefits of the tax credit. That targets the lowest income earners in the country. So targets families like my parents who worked all the time but never made enough to really pay any taxes and never made enough to get the benefit of the child tax credit. What we did, so everybody gets the benefit, and then we made it advanceable. In the past, the child tax credit, you can only get it when you filed your taxes. But how many people have one bill that they have to only pay once a year? Most families don't live that way. They have monthly bills, everything from rent to food to trying to take care of some emergencies that they come up, and that what they need to do is they need to be able to plan. So we made this advanceable. It made only half of it advanceable. So any family got $250 to $300 per child. And this was amazing. In the short year, that half a year that the program was in place, we reduced child poverty in this country anywhere from 40 to 60%, depending on the state and the community you lived in. 2 changes: made it fully advanceable, and made it fully refundable. So that's an idea. That's the idea of the power of a policy can have on lifting kids out of poverty. That's something that we believe that we need to go back and do and make it permanent. We fought to get it into the Build Back Better Act, and we got it in there. And then, of course, we hit a brick wall in the Senate. But we haven't given up, because it's one of those rare programs that has such a profound impact with two little policy changes. So that's kind of what I think we need to do, is really focus on policy, but how does it change people's lives on the ground in a day-to-day way? How does it lift people out of poverty? That's what we need to do. The child tax credit is a perfect example of our efforts to do that, and also focuses on equity. Since we knew that the minute that this program would end, that a large percentage of the families would fall back into poverty. We've already seen that in the first several months. Some of them are still receiving the benefits of the child tax credit because of they're getting that second half that they didn't get last year. They're getting it as they're filing their taxes. But it's not going to exist moving forward. So what we want to do is make sure that we pass that piece of legislation either as a standalone or included in a budget reconciliation that I think they're having some conversations in the Senate. But that's one policy that I think we can have a profound impact. Another issue is how what I care about. Another issue I care about is helping families stay in their homes. So I have a bill called the Rent Relief Act. It's similar to a child tax credit. It is a fully refundable payment for people under a certain income level. And if you pay more than 30% of your house, the federal government will give you a monthly payment of the difference between what you pay and that 30%. That is something that will help put money directly into the pockets of families, of workers, and also make sure that kids are not going to be pushed out on the streets with their parents because hold on. I think, did I lose you?
I think we can hear you. You're a little bit frozen.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
There we go. So those are a few ideas, but we're having a profound impact. One of the things I also would love to see is paid family leave. We we expanded it here in California when I was a member of the Assembly. I restructured it. It's based on the same idea. The people at the lowest rungs of the economic ladder should get the most help. They get a higher wage replacement that allows them to actually afford to use the program that they paid into. At the federal level, when we put the paid family leave program in, I argued and successfully included a same progressive wage replacement for the paid family leave program at the federal level. Still in the Build Back Better Act, we need to get that done. So we're working across the board. I think we're going to have some good successes, but the one bill that if I can wish one bill to get done is the child tax credit, because that is something that it has already shown and proven to have a deep impact on working people, especially kids. And I think that we'll be all better off if we get that program extended for at least a couple more years.
Thank you, Congressman. We're so
I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me?
Hello? If you can hear me.
I can hear you. Well, I was going to say thank you for your leadership on all those policy areas, particularly the child tax credit and paid family leave, which I know is really dear to your heart.
For some reason, I can't hear you, but I guess that's my cue.
No.
So I want to just say thank you for having this webinar. These are important issues. There are other pieces of legislation that we're dealing with to tackle poverty. I have the enhanced access to SNAP benefits, but that's targeted at college students. It's all targeted on reducing poverty in this country. We shouldn't be in a place in a country that's the wealthiest has the access to mostly anything anybody wants, where kids and families are still struggling with the basic necessities like food and water and a place to sleep and live. So that's we're gonna still continue working on it through the Ways and Means Committee, and we're gonna continue having them at the forefront of our debate. With that, I'll log off. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. And again, thank you for your leadership on these specific policy areas. I think one of the things that you're really uplifting in addition to those specific pieces is how each of those are really critical to this roadmap of getting children and families out of poverty. And so I think With that, I will turn us to some additional remarks that we have from Congresswoman Judy Chu and Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs. We're excited to have both of them next. Congresswoman Chu has served in Congress since 2009, where she was elected as the first Chinese American woman to serve in history. She represents the 27th District of California, which here is in Southern California, Pasadena, the San Gabriel Valley, for those of you who don't know. And she also serves with Congressman Gomez on the Powerful Ways and Means Committee. Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs is the youngest member of our California congressional delegation, and she represents the 53rd District, which is home to San Diego, her hometown, where she also was the founding chair of San Diego for Every Child, which is a coalition dedicated to children experiencing poverty in San Diego. So with that, I'll turn it over to their pre-recorded remarks.
Hello, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu. Thank you for inviting me here today for this important discussion on ending child poverty on both the state and federal levels. Poverty can have lifelong adverse impacts on childhood development, and children living in poverty are at risk for poor outcomes in health, developmental delays, and lower academic achievements. Despite having the 6th largest economy in the world, in California, 1 in 5 children are living in poverty. That's nearly 2 million children. This means children struggling to learn because they have hungry bellies or who aren't getting the rest they need because they do not have a safe place to sleep in every night. And as a psychologist, I'm also concerned about the mental health impact that poverty has on children, which can often go untreated as families struggle with more immediate necessities like food and shelter. And the economic crisis caused by the pandemic has only made the situation more dire. That is why I fought so hard on the federal level to make sure that our pandemic relief efforts included provisions directly targeted at ending child poverty. As a member of the Ways and Means Committee, I had a front row seat to the debates in Congress over how to allocate our pandemic relief resources. This includes the American Rescue Plan, which Congress passed last year, which provided an injection of critical funding to help us turn the corner on the pandemic. One of the aspects of this law that I'm most proud of was the expansion of the child tax credit, which put money directly in the pockets of working families every single month. The expanded CTC benefited 66 million children across the country, and about 10,000 were in my district in California. This included people like my constituent Daisy. Daisy is a teacher in Pasadena, California, and was able to use the monthly child tax credit payments to support her 4-year-old son and rebuild her savings, providing her with a sense of relief and security after a tumultuous year. And this fall, the House moved to build on this historic investment and passed legislation to advance President Biden's social safety net policies, including measures like expanding childcare and universal pre-K, guaranteeing universal paid leave, and extending the expanded child tax credit. This plan is a reflection of our values that we must invest in the families of this country and in the most vulnerable, because when we invest in children, we invest in our future. These efforts have hit a roadblock in Washington, D.C., but that does not mean the fight is over. We have other avenues to enact real progress, such as the recently passed omnibus spending bill, which funded our government through the remainder of this fiscal year. This critically important piece of legislation included significant increases in funding for crucial programs such as the Child Care and Development Block Grant, which provides funding to states for child care subsidies for low-income families. It also included increased funding for our nation's pre-K programs, Head Start and Early Head Start. More funding for these programs means more spots in early learning programs so children from low-income families can attend preschool programs for free before kindergarten, setting them up for academic success. Finally, the omnibus also included an increase in the Women, Infants, and Children Nutrition Program, also known as WIC. This program does so much to ensure that new moms and their children have the nutritious food they need, And we know that for every dollar we spend on WIC, we save up to $3 on educational and productivity costs down the line. It's a program that works, and one that I was thrilled to see included in the omnibus package when I voted for it to become law. And as we start the fiscal year 23 appropriations process, you can rest assured that I will continue to advocate for funding for these kinds of programs that we know make a difference. So thank you for all of the work that you do for the children of California and for our community as a whole. Together, we will reduce child poverty and ensure that our youth have a healthy and safe future.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the First Focus Campaign for Children and the U.S. Child Poverty Action Group, along with Grace and End Child Poverty CA, for putting this event together. There are so many incredible advocates and partners joining today, so I want to start with thank you. Thank you for everything you've done over the last few years to push for policy change in your states and in Congress. Thank you for doing the work so that when the pandemic exposed and exacerbated an issue that we all have long known was a problem, we had the tools ready to go. As many of you know, before I came to Congress, I founded San Diego for Every Child, a coalition dedicated to ending the experience of childhood poverty in San Diego. And when the pandemic hit, we adapted our mission to serve San Diegans in crisis, mobilizing funding to support childcare for essential workers. And now I'm proud to be continuing the fight to end child poverty and bolster our childcare system in Congress. Right now, children are the poorest group in the United States, and our child poverty remains shockingly high compared to our economic peers. And even in some of our wealthiest states like California and in some of the wealthiest areas like my district in San Diego, there are still so many children experiencing poverty. In San Diego, more than 40% of kids were in families experiencing poverty before the pandemic. And that's why your advocacy is so critical, because we all know that child poverty is solvable. We just need the political will to solve it. In the last year, just by taking one step, expanding the child tax credit, we reduced child poverty by nearly 30% and lifted millions of kids out of poverty in a matter of months. The expanded child tax credit, which I was proud to fight for and proud to vote for, showed how much progress we can make with a single policy change. But it also showed the consequences of inaction. Because in January, when the expanded child tax credit ended, 3 million children fell back into poverty. And that is what makes this moment so critical. As a country, we need a clear national goal to reduce child poverty, and we need data to inform our decisions and make sure no child is falling through the cracks. That's why I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Child Poverty Reduction Act, and why I'm so grateful for your advocacy on behalf of this bill. I'm also excited to work with the First Focus Campaign for Children to fight for more funding for better and more timely data on child poverty and material hardship. We've seen in California, thanks in part to Grace and End Child Poverty CA, that if we set ambitious goals and prioritize investing in kids, we can make incredible progress. Ending child poverty isn't just the right thing to do to give kids and families a strong start. It's also the fiscally responsible thing to do. Child poverty costs our economy up to $1.1 trillion a year in lost productivity, increased healthcare costs, and more. And it robs us of so much unrealized potential. So we need your voice, we need your expertise, and we need your partnership. I know that the case for reducing child poverty is so strong that we can get this done, and that's what I'm committed to doing, working alongside all of you. So thank you so much for everything that you do.
Thanks so much, Congresswoman. We are so grateful for your leadership, and we want to thank Congressman Gomez and Congresswoman Chu as well for their remarks. So now we're going to move on to our esteemed panel, and I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to hear from a few more members of Congress as well. So first, Shamika Gaskins, who you heard from a little already, again, is the president and CEO of Grace and the End Child Poverty California campaign. Crystal Charles is a policy analyst with the Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy in New York State. And Carmen Isidora Rodriguez is the Director of Advocacy at the Youth Development Institute in Puerto Rico, and we'll be hearing some pre-recorded remarks from her as she currently is traveling around Puerto Rico to educate families about the child tax credit. So I know we are all really looking forward to hearing about the work in these communities, and there's no one better to help kick us off to first hear more about California's leadership than Rep. Karen Bass, who represents the diverse 37th District of California. She's on the Judiciary Committee and founded the Congressional Caucus on Foster Youth. She's a longtime leader for kids and families and will be really sorely missed when she leaves Congress at the end of this session. So we're going to hear some recorded remarks from her and then hear from Shamika, who will further detail efforts in California.
Hello, everyone. Let me thank you at Grace for all of the work that you do on behalf of childhood poverty. The work that Grace has done statewide, getting the legislature and the governor on board with very specific legislation that absolutely will improve the quality of life for children in California. And you know, I'm going to continue working on the child tax credit. We had such a good victory last year. During COVID, we were able to get the child tax credit to millions of households that lifted children out of poverty. Unfortunately, it expired, but it's never too late because there is that bill that is sitting in the Senate right now that we need to make sure it gets passed because all of those millions of families that experience positively the child tax credit are waiting for it to be extended. Unfortunately, it expired at the beginning of the year, but it's never too late. I'm going to continue working on my end to get it extended, and I hope Grace continues on your end, improving the plight of children in California. And thank you so much for your advocacy nationally on behalf of the child tax credit. Your work is invaluable. You save the lives of so many children in California. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass. We're so happy and excited to have your remarks and your support over the last several years as we've worked on this campaign with many of our partners across the state. I think, prior to joining Grace and the End Child Poverty campaign, where I've been here about 8 months now, I led the Children's Defense Fund's California office. And one thing that was really clear to me as we worked on the social safety net and poverty from that position is that issues of poverty cannot be resolved unless we all come together and work together to move the needle. So I'm excited to be here today to share about the work and progress we've made in California and to learn from others on this panel and those of you who are joining us virtually, because it will take all of us at the state and federal level to make sure that we eradicate poverty. So California, as you all know, is one of the largest states in the country and has combated the issue of high child poverty rates for many years. Many organizations have been fighting to change conditions and to pass policies for decades. And there has been success and that we were proud of in California. We've been able to increase the minimum wage. We've eliminated maximum family grants in our CalWorks program, which is very similar to our state version of TANF. We've expanded healthcare coverage, and we created our own tax credit to get more cash to families almost 6 years ago. But in 2018, we still had over 2 million children living in poverty. And it wasn't concentrated in one jurisdiction, but all across the state, from urban to rural areas. Everywhere, families were struggling in this state even with the enormous wealth, and California being the 5th largest economy in the world. So our organization, GRACE, which stands for Gather, Respect, Advocate, Change, and Engage, pushed for the establishment of a legislative task force to create a plan to lift children and families out of poverty. The task force was chaired by our Department of Social Services and Grace as a co-chair, and it brought together experts and advocates across many sectors of housing, homelessness, traditional anti-poverty groups who are working on the social safety net, education, early education, childcare providers, child welfare, and juvenile justice advocates to really come together and draft a comprehensive plan. We work with Stanford Center on Poverty and Equality to provide data and metrics to show that if we created a roadmap with specific investments that would end deep child poverty and could reduce child poverty by 50% within 10 years. The goal was to have the best data, researched, and lived experience inform that roadmap that then could be refined by the legislative process and then moved into action. So we finished the drafting process in 2019 and then handed the plan over to our newly elected governor, Gavin Newsom, who had run on declaring that poverty would be the North Star of his administration. And so the timing couldn't have been more perfect, as we had this really comprehensive plan that included 43 recommendations specifically on early childhood investments, improvements to the social safety net, healthcare, education and workforce, coordination of services, data, infrastructure, and what we also called special populations. And those were recommendations specific to foster youth and youth in the juvenile justice system. So Grace then went to work to move that plan into action, so it wouldn't be a document that just sat on a shelf, by building a coalition of supporters, many of whom were the very people who worked on the plan, and to get legislative members to champion specific recommendations to move those across the finish line. We hosted a bus tour that went all across the state, from San Diego, where every child in San Diego is, to LA, to Central Valley, the Bay Area, and Sacramento, to garner awareness from the public and to get everybody in support of this plan. And so after we did that, we were able to really begin to build a cross-sector coalition, starting with the organizations who were championing those policies and bills and budget asks, and that were then moved into the recommendations of the End Child Poverty Plan. So today, we have over 178 organizations in the coalition, and I'll show you the next slide. And the legislative measures that have been adopted that are either identical or consistent with the plan are up to 38 of the 43 recommendations. 12 of those 38 recommendations are one-time or limited solutions that came out of the pandemic that was really meant to address the dire needs of children and families at that time. And then 26 are permanent, ongoing commitments. With state and federal investments, you can see here, it's really small, but I promise we have a link to this report later. We saw the number of children in poverty reduce year over year. And specifically during 2021, we saw a significant decrease because of the federal and state investments that happened during the pandemic. And this was before even the very impactful child tax credit at the federal level took effect. The state has invested in 2021 to 2022 this year, almost $11 billion in support of children and families that are part of the plan, and will be over to close to $13 billion annually when all the programs ramp up. So it's been remarkable for us within almost 4 years from the start of when the legislation created the task force to where we are today, the impact that we've been able to have, the support that's come from not only the traditional anti-poverty advocates, but those who are working on housing and homelessness and childcare providers and early ed providers and educators, really seeing the value of everyone coming together to really move beyond to really follow the roadmap and move beyond just really advocating for our one issue. So I'll give you two quick examples of things that we didn't even think were feasible 4 years ago that are happening now as a result of this work. The first was when we were drafting the plan. I remember a few of us were working on the social safety net recommendations, and those are recommendations that were really specifically around our CalWORKs program improvements, our earned income tax credit improvements, but a few of us wanted to explore guaranteed income and baby bonds. And at the time, the sentiment was that, let's see how guaranteed income plays out in the Stockton project. And baby bonds probably would most likely need to happen nationally first. And so they didn't make it into the plan. But last year, I have to say, we all saw how Stockton has worked out really well. And we've seen the impact that pilot program has had across the country and the guaranteed income movement. And the governor included $30 million in the state budget to support guaranteed income for foster youth and pregnant people just this past year. And this year, we're pushing for HOPE accounts, which are modeled after baby bonds for children who've lost a parent or caregiver to COVID and foster youth. So the other example that I wanted to share really quickly is that one of the main recommendations to the plan was a targeted child tax credit to end deep child poverty. It was basically a way to ensure that we were creating some level of income for parents that have zero earnings. And again, in 2019, it was considered too costly at the time to have this recommendation move forward, but it was in the plan. And just a year later, though, because of the efforts of the coalition and others, we created for California the Young Child Tax Credit, which provides $1,000 per family, low-income family with children under the age 6. And this year, because of the lapse in the federal CTC, many of the advocates in California are working to expand that and build upon that infrastructure and have a one-time payment increase of $2,000 per child up to age 17 in a household to really backfill the impact that we've seen by the child tax credit have federally, because we know right now we're at this cliff and this point in which so much of our progress that we want to keep the momentum of is at risk. And so we're working to make sure that we can keep financial resources in the hands of those families. So I'll just say, having a plan and a roadmap has worked for us in California. It gave policymakers a way to focus their efforts. It gave us advocates the opportunity to move out of our silos and really come together and push for, everything that we know children and families need. They need housing, they need cash, they need healthcare. We need the inclusion of immigrant families, and we've been able to do that together, which I'm very proud of. Oh, and then I'll hand it to Crystal.
All right. Hi. I'm so excited to be part of today's conversation. Since 1872, the Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy has advanced policies that improve child health and well-being, enable families to achieve economic security, and augment quality early childhood opportunities with a focus on equity, so all New York children have a fair opportunity to thrive. This year, Schuyler Center celebrates the 150th anniversary of our founding by Louisa Lee Schuyler. Today, our work remains grounded in her ideals of compassion, advocacy, leadership, and partnership. There are more than 6,000 registered lobbyists in New York State. Most of them are not focused on the disenfranchised children and families. We are. New York's Constitution says, "The aid, care, and support of the needy are public concerns and shall be provided by the state." Before the pandemic, over 2 million New Yorkers, including 712,000 children, lived in poverty. New York children are more likely to live in poverty than in 32 other states, with 18%, or nearly 1 in 5, experiencing poverty in 2019. The poverty rate approaches 1 in 3 among children of color and in some communities. The poverty rate, due to structural and systemic racism, child poverty among New York children of color approaches 30%. Black and Latino children are more than twice as likely to live in poverty than their white peers. New York's child poverty rate after the Great Recession rose to 23% in 2011, where it stayed until 2014. For Black children, child poverty hit a post-Great Recession peak of 35% in 2013. For Latino children, child poverty hit a high of 36% in 2011. It was a decade before New York's child poverty rate returned to pre-Great Recession levels. Every year, Schuyler Center and our allies advance policies to address and mitigate child poverty. Every year, policymakers cut, increase, or maintain critical child and family serving programs, making decisions in silos with limited understanding of the holistic and long-term impacts of their budget and policy decisions on families and communities. Even temporary experiences of poverty can affect children's well-being. It affects the social, emotional, and cognitive well-being of developing children and babies. It creates and widens achievement gaps, and it increases the likelihood of child welfare involvement. New York State must be intentional in reducing child poverty this time, post-pandemic. The temporary expansions made to the federal child tax credit as part of pandemic stimulus measures lifted over 3 million children out of poverty, according to the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. An estimated 250,000 of those children were in New York. If made permanent, that single change could reduce child poverty by 40%, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Instead, this historical change was left to expire, resulting in the child poverty rate jumping from 12% to 17% in just 1 month. Armed with this data, we gathered our partners and began our campaign to hashtag New York End Child Poverty last year, aiming to get New York State to publicly commit to cutting child poverty by 50% in 10 years. We tilled the soil of public awareness with op-eds and other earned news media, social media pushes, public testimony at hearings, and raising the issue of child poverty and its sharp impacts at every table in the state: health, child welfare, early childhood, and tax. The momentum in our state was supported by the same issue catching attention at the federal level. We built a powerful coalition, surrounding ourselves with a deep bench of experts, a responsive work group, and concentric circles of engaged advocates from all over the state. In total, we have about 60 enthusiastic partners, including nurses, pediatricians, parents, educators, childcare providers, colleges and universities, hospital leaders, community health centers, child welfare agencies, libraries, youth bureaus, and community-based organizations. We armed our partners with data and coordinated public speaking opportunities to keep the momentum going. We also worked with our legislative champions to educate as many policymakers as possible over the course of the year. We gathered bipartisan co-sponsors representing rural, urban, and suburban communities spanning the entire state. All except 3 members voted to pass New York's Child Poverty Reduction Act. New York's Child Poverty Reduction Act, signed by the governor with chapter amendments in December 2021, declares New York State will take steps necessary to reduce child poverty by 50% in 11 years with attention to racial equity. The act establishes the Child Poverty Reduction Advisory Council, tasked with developing a plan to cut New York's child poverty rate in half over 11 years, and measuring and publicly reporting on progress over time. The act also requires an evaluation of the effects on child poverty of the governor's state budget proposal to be made available to the public. The Advisory Council must also consider policy proposals and release a report outlining expected impacts of the proposals, including but not limited to expanding and strengthening New York's Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit, expanding work training and employment programs, expanding access to subsidized housing, and expanding access to subsidized childcare. These types of programs have been found by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to reduce child poverty. We launched this effort understanding that the Child Poverty Reduction Act being signed into law was the first step of a 10-year campaign. For this goal to be realized, we are gearing up to advocate from both within the Advisory Council and from the outside to ensure the state honors its statutory commitment to cutting child poverty in half in a manner that also reduces racial inequities within 11 years. This year, for New York State's fiscal year 2022 to 2023 budget conversation, our top 3 child poverty reduction priorities were to strengthen and expand New York's child tax credit, take large steps toward implementing universal child care, and secure 3 years of continuous Medicaid coverage for mothers and babies. Moving forward, we're focused on getting the Advisory Council seated in a timely manner and supporting bold poverty-fighting policies. Thank you. Okay, next up we have Carmen.
Saludos to everyone who joined in and to all those who have made a personal, institutional, and political commitment to end child poverty everywhere. My name is Carmen Rizaura Rodriguez Arroyo. I am the Advocacy Director at the Instituto del Desarrollo de la Juventud. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated exclusively to promoting public policy that can verifiably reduce the child poverty rate in Puerto Rico and make economic mobility attainable for families with children. Child poverty is a persistent problem in Puerto Rico that has lasting consequences on the well-being of our children and our economy. For more than 2 decades, our child poverty rate has remained at or around 57%, and we estimate its consequences cost about 4.3% of our gross domestic product each year. To that, we add the legacy of harm that families have to overcome because of systemic failures in acknowledging and addressing this issue, and the total cost is crushing. But wins advocated for by organizations such as First Focus and leaders within the Child Poverty Action Group have demonstrated that we have a chance to change this. During the 2020 gubernatorial campaign in Puerto Rico, the Instituto coordinated the first ever local gubernatorial debate on child poverty, and all parties made a commitment to address this issue as part of their platform. After the elections, we focused on ensuring commitments turned into action. Through advocacy with allied organizations as part of an anti-poverty coalition, we pressed this issue within the legislature, and local Senate Bill 293 was introduced, with representatives from every party co-authoring it. The bill established a 50% child poverty reduction target in 10 years and created a dedicated commission. On December 31st, 2021, after being approved unanimously in both the House and the Senate, it became Puerto Rico Law 84/2021. The law consigns the government's public policy to develop programs and initiatives to combat child poverty and social inequality. It sets short, intermediate, and long-term targets to reduce child poverty and creates an interagency and multi-sector commission headed by the Department of Family to design and execute these initiatives and to submit recommendations for necessary legislation to further its objective. The 17-member commission has 9 representatives from key government agencies such as the Department of the Family, Treasury, Education, Economic Development and Commerce, Housing, and others, as well as 5 members from the nonprofit sector and 3 community leaders. These other 8 members have to be representative from at least 7 different geographical regions in our archipelago to ensure that the solutions to poverty take into account and are aligned with the multifaceted needs of our diverse communities experiencing poverty. Based in part on recommendations included in our 2020 report on child poverty in Puerto Rico, working groups within the Commission will address specific priorities such as education, economic security, tax credits, workforce, eliminating obstacles to work, access to health care, and food security. The fiscal plan proposed for the 2022-2023 year expands the state budget to combat child poverty to $3.7 million. We await the Commission's first report, which is expected to include a radiography of current programs, major agency roadblocks, and additional available funds. With the passing of Law 84/2021, we now have a powerful tool to guide the multi-sector collaborative efforts necessary to reduce child poverty in our archipelago and to hold the government accountable to its commitment to create a future without child poverty. This is monumental, as it's the first major acknowledgement of the child poverty crisis in Puerto Rico. But our journey is just beginning. After establishing child poverty as a policy priority, the agencies and nonprofit sector have been more closely collaborating in poverty-reducing initiatives. Since December, we've led a multi-sector coalition focused around child tax credit efforts in Puerto Rico, as this year, families in Puerto Rico are no longer required to have 3 children or more to access this benefit. We've seen government efforts to increase their capacity to provide outreach to communities island-wide in coordination with nonprofits and community leaders. We look forward to confirming the impact the CTC, as well as the local expanded earned income tax credit, have in lifting our families out of poverty and implementing other significant policy measures to achieve our goal. The Institute is further committed to supporting this process through our recently launched Economic Mobility Policy Lab, which aims to identify and promote the use of data and best practices among diverse programs in Puerto Rico that provide services for families with children in order to increase the scope and scale of programs that have a proven impact in economic mobility. We are providing workshops on 2-generation models to various government agencies and programs that provide services to families with children. We also have an amazing policy fellow with a lot of experience in interagency coordination who will provide technical assistance to the Commission in creating its work plan and tracking its progress. Puerto Rico joined a movement in accountability. We want to see our families lifted out of poverty through ongoing local commitments. Because of our territorial status, federal policy is also inextricably linked to our success. A national child poverty target will ensure that necessary infrastructure to make sustained progress on child poverty reduction. Every child matters. If we can make this commitment, so must you.
Thanks so much to Shamika, to Chris. Thanks so much to Shamika, to Crystal, to Carmen for sharing all of your efforts and leadership. I hope everyone is feeling really inspired after hearing about these efforts. And, I hope you're thinking of some good questions for our great panel. So if you haven't already, please feel free to start submitting your questions in the chat, in comments, or if you're watching on Twitter using the hashtag #EndChildPoverty. So to get us further inspired about all the work you just heard about and how we can take action on the federal level, we are going to hear from our final members of Congress. So last but certainly not least, Representative Lucia Roybal-Allard, who represents the vibrant 40th District of California as in leadership in the House Appropriations Committee, and Congressman Danny Davis, who chairs the Worker and Family Support Subcommittee in the Ways and Means Committee, and he represents the dynamic 7th District of Illinois, and he is the lead on the Federal Child Poverty Reduction Act, which you're going to hear more about soon. They are both really longtime champions in making child poverty reduction a top priority. And I'll note that Congresswoman Roybal-Allard is leaving Congress at the end of the session, and she's also going to be really sorely missed. So for that, I'm going to turn it over to them, and we have pre-recorded remarks from both.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to join you for this virtual briefing on ending child poverty at the federal and state level. I thank First Focus and the rest of the Child Poverty Action Group and Grace End Child Poverty California for hosting today's briefing. I commend all of you for your incredible work to raise the visibility of child poverty in the United States and bring it to an end. It was 2014 when, as a member of the Labor HHS Appropriations Subcommittee, the First Focus Campaign for Children approached me to find a way for the National Academies of Science to conduct a child poverty study. I was immediately interested in this effort because in my congressional district, 24% of families live in poverty. 50% of children live 150% below the poverty line, and 11% live in extreme poverty. During my initial meeting with First Focus, they proposed having a National Academies of Science consensus study, which would produce bipartisan recommendations on how the U.S. in 10 years could reduce by half the number of children living in poverty. This sounded like an impossible goal until I was reminded that in 1999, the United Kingdom had established a similar national goal, and in 2009 successfully reduced by half the number of UK children living in poverty. I immediately reached out to my incredible colleague Barbara Lee, a longtime champion of children and a fierce fighter against poverty. Over the next few years, we worked tirelessly to secure the funding for a landmark study on child poverty from the National Academies of Science. The NAS study, a roadmap to reducing child poverty, was released in 2019 with a plan to significantly reduce child poverty in the United States. The findings from this NAS study have been instrumental in the development of recent policy, including the child tax credit provisions in the American Rescue Plan, which helped cut child poverty nearly in half in 2021. Significant progress was made due to the investment in the American Rescue Plan. Sadly, with the expiration of monthly child tax credit payments and other critical assistance, millions of children are now being pushed back into poverty. So our mission is far from over. We must renew and strengthen our efforts to end child poverty in our nation. Towards that end, Congresswoman Lee and I worked with Chairman DeLauro to include language in the FY22 Appropriations Bill that would establish a Children's Interagency Coordinating Council at the Department of Health and Human Services. This council will foster greater collaboration and transparency on child policy among federal agencies. Once this council is established, among other tasks, we hope agencies will work with the National Academies of Science to analyze and report on how existing and emerging federal policies are affecting child poverty. This collaboration will provide data critically needed to inform efforts towards ending child poverty in the United States. I am also proud to be a co-sponsor of the Child Poverty Reduction Act, which would establish a national target to end child poverty in the United States. At the state level, I am pleased my home state of California is leading the way to eliminate child poverty. In 2017, California advocates, researchers, and lawmakers joined together to pass AB 1520, the Lifting Children and Families Out of Poverty Act. This bill created a state task force with a mandate to develop a plan to significantly reduce child poverty and eliminate entirely deep child poverty in California. Advocates in the End Child Poverty in California campaign have worked hard to pass and implement parts of this plan and have secured significant policy wins, including the 2019 establishment of a state young child tax credit. It is my hope that Congress and the rest of the country will quickly follow California's lead because time is our enemy. We have seen the tragic and lifelong impact child poverty has on individual families and our society. We know how malnutrition and poor health can result in poor academic performance and leave children in intergenerational poverty, which reduces the economic opportunities for them, their children, their family, and ultimately our country. Thanks to the National Academies of Science, we know what needs to be done. But it will take your continued advocacy and determination and the combined efforts of all of us working together to create the political will to truly end child poverty in our country. As you may know, I have decided to retire at the end of this year. It has been the privilege of a lifetime to work with the First Focus Campaign for Children and my incredible friend and colleague, Barbara Lee, to highlight child poverty and promote solutions that give all children a chance for a better future. It is with respect and admiration that I salute you all for your efforts. During the months I have left in Congress, I look forward to continuing to work with you to set a national goal of ending child poverty in the United States. To our audience, thank you for taking the time to learn more about this national tragedy and its very tangible and achievable solutions. I hope you find this briefing informative and inspirational.
I'm Danny Davis from Chicago, and I want to thank the U.S. Child Poverty Action Group and the Grace and End Poverty California campaign for inviting me to speak and share this time with you. I am proud to co-lead the federal effort to end child poverty by advancing the Child Poverty Reduction Act, with my wonderful colleagues from California, Barbara Lee and Lucille Robo Allard. It is important that our nation commit to setting a child poverty reduction goal and then implement an accountability framework to ensure that we achieve this goal. The work by California to set a child poverty reduction target, secure policy changes, and measure the reduction in child poverty is a strong example for the federal government. If this approach works, California's work builds on that from Canada and the United Kingdom. I am honored to have helped enact key federal policy changes this last year that substantially reduced child poverty. Unfortunately, these policies currently are only temporary. Child poverty is a solvable problem. We must do more to permanently reduce child poverty. We could use your help in asking your federal legislators to support H.R. 1558, the Child Poverty Reduction Act, so that we demonstrate the importance of committing our nation to reducing child poverty. The more co-sponsors we get on the bill, the more likely the bill is to advance. In addition to setting the child poverty reduction target, the bill charges the executive branch with monitoring our progress, examining our success in real time will inform our policy work. If our policies fail to diminish child poverty, we need to do more. If our policies succeed in reducing poverty, then we stay the course. Without continuous monitoring of child poverty during our recovery, we risk irreparable harm to our youngest children, especially children of color. So I thank each of you for your commitment to the hard work of reducing child poverty. I trust that you will have a good event. We're off to a great start with enhancement of our child tax credit policies. But of course, we need to do more. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks so much, Congressman, to your leadership, and to Congresswoman Lucille Robo Allard for her leadership. You heard it from them. You know, we know what to do, but we need action to make it happen, right? And we just heard the directive from the Congressman. We need your help. We need your support. And we need you to reach out to your members of Congress. Okay, so here how we could go about it. You know, we have been working for some time to build on the efforts, you know, that you just heard about in California and New York and Puerto Rico and other jurisdictions around the country to establish a national child poverty reduction target here in the United States. And we hope to do that through the passage of the Child Poverty Reduction Act, which is currently bill number 643 in the Senate. And you just heard from the Congressman, 1558 in the House. And it would not only codify a national child poverty reduction target, but would also prove upon current data to analyze and monitor progress towards this goal. So, you know, as we've heard, we know we have a roadmap to reducing child poverty. The 2019 National Academy of Sciences study and the evidence of the impact of last year's child tax credit payments show us what works, but we need help in politically getting these things done. Establishing a target through the Child Poverty Reduction Act is a way to apply pressure to lawmakers to pass a child allowance and other priorities that will significantly reduce child poverty for the long term. So what can you do after hearing about all these efforts around the country and then, you know, this bill on the federal level? We have an action alert that we are hoping you will send and share through your networks to urge your congressional delegation to co-sponsor the bill. We are trying to get this bill included in an end-of-year spending package, but first we need a long list of co-sponsors to show congressional leaders that this bill should be a priority. We also recently sent a letter with over 100 groups asking congressional leaders to support this bill. If your organization didn't make it on the letter, but you still want to formally endorse, you can feel free to email me at carab@firstfocus.org. And if you are undertaking efforts in your own state or community that weren't covered here today, I want to hear about them so we can uplift them. So, to recap, please send out and share the action alert with your network. Please endorse the bill if you haven't already, and please share your work with us. So, we're really excited now to take your questions. And I'm going to invite Shamika and Crystal to join me. Great. Hi. And so please, if you're in the audience, don't be shy. Please submit your questions in whatever form. If you're on Twitter, you can tweet at us or in the chat or comments if you're watching on YouTube. So while we're waiting for your questions, one question I have, Shamika and Crystal, for both of you, what advice do you have for other advocates out there who might, be inspired by your efforts and want to undertake similar efforts in their jurisdictions? Shamika, why don't you get us started?
Great. Well, I will just say I'm super inspired by hearing from Crystal and Carmen about their efforts. And I think it was really interesting to hear the different ways that each state has approached getting to the same place. And I know Crystal, they're sort of the beginning of their process, and Carmen, have their sort of working groups being set up. But I think my advice would be really trying to, bring the advocates together in your community that are working on whether it's child poverty or issues related to child poverty that impact children and families, and really begin to have that conversation together of how can you start that process of coming together and figuring out what's the best vehicle to move the needle on poverty reduction. Because I do think it really does start at that grassroots level to think about, how can we, at best, when you can bring people together first and think about what's the strategic way, because it's going to be different in every state, right? It may be starting off with a bill that establishes a target, and it could be how we did it is starting a task force and building that momentum to get there. So I think that's probably the best advice I could give, is to really start to bring people together and brainstorm and think about and strategize based on your political environment and climate, how to get to that goal.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That's where my advice lies as well. Gather partners. I think it needs to be clear that this is an ask and a goal and a need statewide. And, we know very well how poverty impacts all those different areas that even in the advocacy space, we might be siloed in, health, education, housing, child welfare involvement. So the people who are advocating for this change need to span all those different areas and more. And that's going to probably take a while, depending on your existing relationships, but it's definitely worth it. When it's clear that, you're doing sign-on letters and getting sign-ons from all over, that this is a need and it's an urgent priority for the state.
Great. Another question that I think would be really helpful for folks to hear is, and Shamika, please feel free to build on this. I think that we know that, having a strong and effective narrative is so important to getting this work done, right? We need effective policies, but we also need an effective narrative to getting these policies done. So if both of you could speak, to how that's worked, for you, the kind of focus and attention that you've thought about in building a narrative in order to get the policies, in your plans done. And Crystal, I know you guys are still starting out in implementing those policies, but to even get the target right and the council to begin with, I'm assuming it was helpful to have a powerful narrative. So Would love to hear both of you. And then I think we have a question from our audience that we'll get to next.
Great. I'll start. Yeah, I definitely say that building a narrative, or at least establishing a framework for analyzing existing policies, budget decisions through the lens of reducing child poverty was a major part of our campaign and continues to be a major part of our advocacy on this moving forward. Because that, was lacking before. So we've always supported the individual policies that would reduce child poverty, but having an umbrella to unite them under with the goal, the long-term goal of reducing child poverty over a certain period of time really helps put those policies into perspective. And I think another piece of our narrative has to do with the pandemic. So that's a context none of us can ignore. And it also put into kind of stark relief the existing racial inequities that we were so focused on making sure that reducing racial inequities was part of the Child Poverty Reduction Act as well. So in the context of the pandemic, focusing on helping New Yorkers recover and thrive after this, if there is an after. That is all part of our, narrative to be clear about that perspective, that context, and the impact on the communities that are always harshest impacted by events like the pandemic or ongoing issues like poverty.
Yeah, I think that in terms of the narrative, I would build upon what Crystal just said and just also add that I think what was really key in building the End Child Poverty Plan for California was, really having those who are most impacted be a part of the process in creating those solutions, because I think that's a key part of the narrative that always gets sort of left out. When all of us who are working on these issues are so deeply embedded and care so much that we're also, really trying to make sure that we're centering those who are impacted, and that because we know those solutions exist in community and can be really the things that we need to uplift. And so I think that has been a narrative shift for our organizations, for our coalition, is like, how do we make sure that what we are advocating for isn't just because it's a healthcare policy, but actually something that we know is deeply impactful and actually going to be effective in our communities after they're implemented. So I think that's been part of it. And then I think also for California, it's really been about telling the true story of who's in poverty and why people are in poverty. I think Crystal lifted up, racial inequities, but systemic oppression, wages, all of those things that I think people just sort of push to the side and say, well, why is that person in poverty? Why is that person homeless? But in fact, we know it's all created by the policies and systemic oppression. And so I think really being able to uplift and tell that story while asking lawmakers to do better. In a really progressive state, because I think that also clouds our narrative here, is like California is so progressive. We've been a leader in all these other pieces, but yet we have this moral stain of this continued wealth inequality and this continued gap of really serving those who are working really hard every day. Like you heard Representative Gomez talk about his parents working 4 or 5 jobs to keep, a roof over their head and food on their table. And we know that takes away from children. It takes away from the parents' ability to be there for them. And so they're working, and yet we still can't make ends meet. And so I think that is the story that we want to make sure continues to get out, because it's not just unique to California, it's all across the country. We know people are working and working really hard. And for those who can't work, why aren't we supporting them? Because we have the resources to do it. And so I think that's been a part of the narrative that we really want to push. And then I would say, finally, I think this piece around, really having goals and a plan, it can be can be hard because we know we want to focus also on the policies, right? Because that's going to be the most impactful. That's what we're going to see change. But I think also having some place to go back and say, are we making progress? How far have we gotten? Is this working? Is really critical to seeing, how well we've come. I think when we took a look back past in December with Stanford, started to do some work for us and really looking at what's the difference between child poverty today without the social safety net, or would have been if we didn't have some of these safety net programs, and it would be over 30% in California. So, getting back to some of those levels that you heard Carmen talk about in Puerto Rico, getting really close to that. So I think, it really is important that it's a both and not an either or. And I think what you're seeing and hearing from today is that we can do both and that we need both. And so I think that those are the things that I would probably look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I echo everything both of you said. And I think, to add is that sometimes, we see something that works, right? Like we saw the improvements to the child tax credit. And then, unfortunately, we backtrack a bit, right? And what's really important to, I think, include in a narrative is that, even for the 6 months of payments, that many children received, that had an impact, right, on those children that could really help them in the long term. And then, as they continue to hopefully receive, right, the rest of the child tax credit that they're due, right now at tax time, as Congressman Gomez talked about, that amount of money, even for a year, right, that increase really has an impact for kids. And of course, we should use that to then build and really continue to advocate, right, to make those improvements permanent. But it's not that, we stopped them for now, so we totally failed and it did nothing, right? We that made an impact, and having, a target and, folks that could come together, that helps to track those things and elevate it, right? And make sure, and hopefully help prevent backtracking, right? As I know, there's so many now working on, for the child tax credit, for example. So, I think that's another way that hopefully we can turn around the narrative as well. So, so I think we have a kind of two-part question from an audience member that we'll take. And so, can both of you speak to, why it's really important to look at the impact of reducing child poverty, for children when we're looking at, particular barriers that children who are living in rural communities have, right, or urban communities, as well as, I know we talked a little bit already, right, reducing racial and ethnic disparities. And then a second corollary to that is also if you can speak to any data that both of you, have or use as kind of, the impact of reducing poverty, reducing the long-term health impacts of reducing child poverty, and why that could be, helpful as part of advocacy. I think especially, right, as we're still, unfortunately, in the middle of a pandemic. So, Shamika, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, I can kick us off. So thank you so much, Dr. Ney, for your questions. I think they're really important. I think, and this probably will be true for New York too, because we're both really big states with very diverse topography. California has, our farmland. We have way up north in urban areas. And one of the things I think that we've always tried to do is think about, when we're as a statewide policy making, how can we have the greatest impact overall? And I think we try to look at, where are the highest number of children living in poverty, but what we know will work based on what their families are experiencing. So whether you're a farm worker in the Central Valley, or you are, a janitor here in Southern California, and you have a family and you're barely making ends meet, we know policies like a child tax credit is going to really help either of those families, and to make sure that those amounts are significant enough that it's going to have an impact. So $1,000 for that family, whether you're in the Central Valley or in an urban area, is going to still have enough impact to be able to be for those dollars to be felt for those families and for children. And I think So that's something that we always think about too, is like where are we seeing the biggest number of children, but also how can we make sure that whatever policies we're pushing, are going to have an impact for those families, regardless of where you live in the state. And I think it's pretty much just universal that California is a very expensive state to live in. So, I think we try to keep that in mind as well. And one of the ways that we do that is we actually have our own poverty measure called the California Poverty Measure that takes in account the things that you need, the benefits that you might be able to receive to finally figure out the true cost of living here, and what it takes for a family to be successful. And we've really relied on our partners like United Ways of California and others who do that deep data dive and to figure out, what does it really take for a family of 4 in LA to live versus a family in the Central Valley or the Bay Area, and to make sure our policies are reflective of being able to impact all of those demographics.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities between New York and California. I think, that reputation for being a wealthy state often obfuscates how serious the poverty problems are. So, like, part of the question was, urban versus rural, for example. And what we've seen in our data is that, of course, there's the racial inequity, but poverty is everywhere. It's in the big cities. Like, one of our worst poverty levels in the state is in the Bronx, which is in New York City. But we also see high poverty rates in a bunch of our other large cities besides New York City that are throughout the state. And I think overall you see maybe more rural counties have a larger poverty issue as well. But I think part of what allowed us to gain momentum on this issue was that it is everywhere. And I also want to answer the health impacts question as well. So the kind of early childhood advocacy community was very vocal in our push for the Child Poverty Reduction Act here in New York, because when a baby or toddler is experiencing child poverty, that's a crucial time in their development, and poverty can have lasting impacts on these children. So they will be experiencing the negative impacts of poverty long after they've reached adulthood. And poverty is often an intergenerational issue as well. So it's so intersectional. We have geography, we have race, ethnicity, and then we have the intergenerational kind of cycle that develops when a child is experiencing poverty, and then they grow up and they're more likely to still be poor as an adult, and then they have their own family. So a lot of what drives this work is trying to break those intergenerational cycles for New York's children and families.
Well, thanks so much. I think we're at our time. So I just want to thank you both and Carmen. I want to thank all of the members of Congress we heard from today, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining. Again, if you registered, we'll be sending you the recording and materials directly. If not, they'll also be on our website, endchildpovertyus.org, under the webinars tab in the next few days. And please feel free to reach out to any of us with questions or to hopefully maybe collaborate in the future. So I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and thanks again for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.